The Once and Future Present, Episode 14, Centralization, Absolutism, and Constitutionalism. Welcome back to the Once and Future Present, the AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today we're going deep into the 1600s to explore how kings, parliaments, armies, and ideas shaped modern government. With me, as always, our Professor Theo.
Great to be here, Casey.
And Dr. Morgan.
Looking forward to pulling apart the tensions between centralized power and limited government.
When you say centralized power, what exactly does that mean? I remember learning that medieval Europe was really fragmented. Was this different?
That's a great question. In the Middle Ages, power was mostly decentralized. Local lords controlled their own land, collected taxes, and even had their own armies. Kings were often just symbolic, with very little real control. We call this system feudalism. But in the 1600s, we see the rise of centralized states, where monarchs begin to take direct control over laws, taxes, the military, and even religion. Instead of relying on nobles, rulers built professional bureaucracies and standing armies that answered only to them. That shift is what makes this period the beginning of modern government.
But why did this happen in the 1600s? Why not earlier?
That's another excellent question. A few big changes came together during this time. For one, Europe was moving away from a purely agrarian economy based on manners and local trade. The expansion of European Atlantic empires, especially with colonies in the Americas and trade in Africa and Asia, created more complex, commercial economies. Monarchs needed more efficient systems to manage this growing wealth and overseas power. Another key factor was military. The adoption of gunpowder weapons changed how wars were fought. Instead of small feudal armies led by nobles, kings started building large professional armies that were loyal to the crown, not to individual lords.
And don't forget the role of ideas and education. Since the Renaissance, humanist ideals had spread, and with the invention of the printing press, literacy expanded. That meant kings had a growing pool of educated subjects who could work as bureaucrats, lawyers, diplomats, and record keepers. This new administrative class was essential for running a centralized government.
Okay, to start us off, this chapter is all about absolutism and constitutionalism. Can one of you explain what those words actually mean?
Sure. Absolutism is when a monarch holds all political power, law, taxes, the military, you name it. They often claim their authority came directly from God, a belief known as the divine right of kings.
Constitutionalism, on the other hand, is the idea that rulers are limited by laws or a constitution. In a constitutional system, a king or queen might still exist, but they have to share power, often with a parliament.
So one system is, I make the rules, and the other is, I have to follow the rules?
Exactly. And during the 1600s, both forms of government were developing side by side in different parts of Europe.
What triggered this big shift in how rulers governed?
The 30 Years' War was a major factor. It began in 1618 and ended in 1648. At first, it was a religious conflict in the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly expanded into a huge political struggle involving almost every major European power. Historians usually break the war into four main phases. The Bohemian phase started with a rebellion against the Catholic Habsburg Emperor in Prague. Protestant nobles threw two royal officials out of a window in what's called the Defenestration of Prague. The rebellion was crushed at the Battle of White Mountain, and the emperor reasserted Catholic control. The Danish phase followed, when the Protestant King Christian IV of Denmark entered the war to support German Protestants. He was defeated by imperial forces led by Albrecht von Wallenstein, and Catholic power expanded. Then came the Swedish phase, when King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, a devout Lutheran, intervened. He won several victories and pushed Catholic forces back, but was killed in battle. The final stage, the Franco-Swedish phase, is where things get really political. Catholic France joined the Protestant side, not because of religion, but because they wanted to weaken the Habsburgs. This is where Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of France, played a key role.
Wait, so France was Catholic but helped the Protestants?
That's right. Richelieu believed in raison d'etat, the idea that the interests of the state are more important than religious unity. He wanted to strengthen France by breaking the Habsburg ring of power around them in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. For him, building a strong French nation-state came first.
I've heard of Richelieu, but who exactly was he? How could a religious leader control France's foreign policy?
Good question. Cardinal Richelieu was a top advisor to King Louis XIII. Even though he was a high-ranking Catholic Church official, he also served as the king's chief minister, basically the head of the government. In that role, he managed state affairs, led diplomatic efforts, and made military decisions. He believed that strengthening the monarchy was the best way to bring stability and power to France, even if that meant going against Catholic allies. His leadership helped lay the foundation for French absolutism, later under Louis XIV.
So it wasn't just Protestants and Catholics fighting?
No, it became about territory and power. For example, France, although Catholic, supported Protestant forces to weaken the Habsburgs, who ruled Spain and the Holy Roman Empire.
The war was devastating. Some areas of Germany lost up to 40% of their population. Famine, disease, and violence destroyed towns and farmland.
That's massive. So how did it finally end?
With the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It recognized the sovereignty of over 300 German princes, meaning each ruler could decide their own state's religion, Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. It also recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic and Switzerland.
Let's start with absolutism. France is the textbook example, right?
Absolutely. The path to absolutism in France began under Henry IV, who restored order after the French Wars of Religion. He issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting limited toleration to Protestants.
But real centralization started with Cardinal Richelieu, who served under Louis XIII. He weakened noble power and outlawed private armies. He also used intendants, royal officials who oversaw provinces and reported directly to the king.
How was that different from what had been the system before?
Good question. Under feudalism, local nobles or governors usually held regional authority and passed it down through family lines. Richelieu's intendants were appointed by the crown, not inherited. They didn't come from the regions they served and weren't beholden to local nobility. Their only loyalty was to the king.
So the king was creating his own network of loyal officials?
Exactly. But this made the nobility and the people angry. After Richelieu died, there was a rebellion known as the Fronde between 1648 and 1653. Nobles and commoners rose up against high taxes and central control.
Wait, weren't the nobles supposed to be loyal to the king?
That's what you'd expect. But in reality, the nobles resented losing their traditional power. They didn't like the crown appointing outsiders or collecting taxes without their approval. So they pushed back, and in some cases even allied with the urban poor. The Fronde was messy and chaotic, and it really frightened the young Louis XIV. The young Louis XIV lived through that chaos. It convinced him that strong, absolute rule was the only way to avoid anarchy.
He's the one who said, "I am the state," right?
That's him. He ruled from 1643 to 1715, the longest reign in European history.
He built the massive Palace of Versailles, which served as both his royal residence and a way to control the nobility. Nobles were required to live there part of the year, participating in elaborate ceremonies and rituals.
That sounds fancy, but also kind of like a power trap.
Exactly. It was all about keeping potential rivals close, dependent, and distracted.
At the same time, Louis XIV was expanding his power at home through control of the economy and the military. His finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, used a system called mercantilism to make France as economically independent as possible. That meant increasing exports, reducing imports, and collecting more taxes.
Mercantilism, that's where a country tries to keep more wealth flowing in than out, right?
Exactly. Colbert wanted to grow France's industries, build up infrastructure like roads and canals, and boost overseas trade. A big part of mercantilism involved using overseas colonies to benefit the mother country. Colonies were expected to supply raw materials, like sugar, tobacco, or furs, that France didn't have. Then, those goods would be shipped back to France, turned into finished products, and sold, sometimes right back to the colonies but at a profit. The idea was to make sure wealth flowed into France, not out. Colonies weren't allowed to trade freely with other nations. They were supposed to serve the economic interests of the motherland. Colbert even created exclusive trading companies and state monopolies to control colonial commerce and maximize profits for the crown. All of this helped make France more self-sufficient. But it also tied the economy closely to imperial competition and global trade. He also used tariffs, taxes on imported goods, to protect French businesses.
And Louis invested heavily in his military. He created the largest standing army in Europe at the time, over 300,000 soldiers. This gave him the power to fight wars and enforce royal authority without needing to rely on the nobility.
But this all came at a price. Louis fought a lot of wars to expand French territory and influence, especially the War of Spanish Succession. These wars were expensive, and by the end of his reign, France was deeply in debt.
So, while he made France more powerful, he also left it with some big problems?
That's a fair summary. His reign shaped the model of absolutism that many other monarchs tried to copy. But it also showed the limits of that power when it strained the people and the treasury too far.
You mentioned earlier that Louis XIV fought a lot of wars. Can we talk about one of them? I heard you mention the War of the Spanish Succession. What was that about?
Great question. The War of the Spanish Succession started in 1701 when the last Habsburg king of Spain died without an heir. Louis XIV wanted his grandson to inherit the Spanish throne. That made other European powers nervous, especially England and the Dutch Republic, because they feared it would unite France and Spain under one dynasty.
So a grand alliance formed to stop France. Even though this was a war about European dynasties, it was also a global war. Battles and rivalries played out not just in Europe, but in the Americas, the Caribbean, and parts of Asia. Colonial trade routes, access to overseas markets, and the control of resources became just as important as land in Europe. This war helped establish Britain's global empire and shifted the balance of power far beyond the continent.
The war dragged on for over a decade and was fought in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Americas. It finally ended in 1713 with the Peace of Utrecht. Louis's grandson got to be King of Spain, but the two crowns had to remain separate.
So, what did other countries get out of the treaty?
Britain gained important territory like Gibraltar and parts of Canada. Even more importantly, they won the asiento, the right to sell slaves in Spanish America. It gave them a powerful economic edge.
The war showed how fragile the balance of power in Europe had become. It also marked Britain's rise as a global naval and colonial power.
Let's move east. How did Austria fit into this new world of centralized states?
The Austrian Habsburgs lost influence in the Holy Roman Empire after the Peace of Westphalia. So they turned their attention toward building power in their own diverse lands, especially Bohemia, Hungary, and Austria.
In Bohemia, they crushed Protestant nobles after 1620 and confiscated their land. They re-Catholicized the region and imposed direct control.
What about Hungary?
That was harder. The Ottoman Empire had occupied parts of Hungary since the early 1500s. The big turning point came in 1683 during the Siege of Vienna, when the Ottomans were finally defeated.
After that, the Habsburgs slowly drove the Ottomans out of Central Europe and incorporated Hungary into their empire. But resistance there remained strong. Hungarian nobles resisted Habsburg control and held on to many of their local privileges.
So, Austria became a more centralized state, but not as tightly controlled as France?
Exactly. It was a multi-ethnic empire, and ruling it meant compromise.
I saw terms like Janissary Corps and millet system in the reading. What were those?
The Janissary Corps were elite Ottoman troops, Christian boys taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers. The millet system was a way for the empire to organize religious communities. Each millet, or religious group, governed itself in areas like marriage and education.
It was relatively tolerant compared to most European countries at the time.
Okay, what about Prussia?
Prussia was smaller, but incredibly efficient. The Hohenzollern family ruled a patchwork of territories in northern Germany. Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, started building a centralized state after the devastation of the 30 Years' War.
He struck a deal with the Junkers, the Prussian nobility. In exchange for their loyalty and support for taxation, he let them dominate the peasants on their estates.
So it was kind of like, support the army and we won't mess with your local power?
Exactly. Later, his grandson, Frederick William I, known as the Soldier King, made the army the center of Prussian society. He doubled its size and created a military-focused bureaucracy.
In Prussia, people used to say the state has an army, but under Frederick William I, the army has a state.
That's intense. What about Russia?
Russia was somewhat isolated from Western Europe until the 1600s. It was ruled by tsars, and the boyars, or Russian nobles, held a lot of power.
That changed under Peter the Great. He ruled from 1682 to 1725 and was determined to modernize or westernize Russia.
What do you mean by westernize?
Peter admired Western technology, military tactics, and culture. He traveled in disguise to the Netherlands and England to study shipbuilding and statecraft. When he returned, he reorganized the army, built a navy, and restructured the government.
He also required noble service in the military or civil bureaucracy, introduced the table of ranks to promote people based on merit, and taxed beards to push Western fashion.
Wait, he taxed beards?
Yes, shaving symbolized turning away from old Orthodox traditions and embracing European customs.
He also built a new capital city, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic Sea. It was designed in the Western European style and built by forced labor, especially from peasants.
That sounds like a lot of change. Did people resist?
Some did. Groups like the Cossacks, who lived on the frontier and valued independence, rebelled. The Stenka Razin rebellion in the 1670s was an example of how the lower classes pushed back, though unsuccessfully.
So that's the absolutist side of things. What about constitutionalism?
England followed a very different path. After Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603 without any children, the Tudor line ended. Her closest Protestant relative was James IV of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the two crowns under one monarch, though not yet one country.
James I believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that God had chosen him to rule. This put him in direct conflict with Parliament, especially over taxes and religion. Parliament believed they had a role in governing, based on earlier traditions like the Magna Carta, which limited the king's authority.
His son, Charles I, pushed things even further. He ruled without Parliament for 11 years, a period called the Personal Rule, and tried to impose religious changes on Scotland, sparking a rebellion.
So he needed money to fight the Scots and had to call Parliament back?
Exactly. But once Parliament returned, it demanded major political reforms. Charles saw himself as an absolute monarch, but Parliament viewed England as a constitutional monarchy where the king must govern with the consent of the people's representatives. These conflicting visions led to the English Civil War in 1642.
The war divided the country. On one side were the royalists, who supported the king. On the other were the parliamentarians, or Roundheads, led by Oliver Cromwell.
Cromwell's new model army was highly trained and effective. They captured Charles I, put him on trial for treason, and executed him in 1649.
Whoa. Executing a king sounds like crossing a line no one expected.
It was unprecedented. For the first time in European history, a reigning monarch was publicly tried and executed by his own people.
Afterward, Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector in a republic called the Protectorate. But it wasn't very democratic. He dismissed Parliament, censored the press, enforced strict Puritan laws, and used the army to expand British control over Ireland, often brutally.
He also expanded the British Navy, laying the groundwork for Britain's later dominance at sea.
Puritans were really strict Protestants, right? Like, no fun allowed?
That's one way to put it. They banned theater, dancing, and even Christmas celebrations.
When Cromwell died, people were tired of strict rule. In 1660, the Restoration brought the monarchy back with Charles II, son of Charles I. But Parliament now had more influence than before.
So that fixed everything?
Not exactly. Charles's brother, James II, was openly Catholic and tried to increase royal authority again. When his wife had a Catholic son, many feared a permanent Catholic dynasty.
That's when Parliament acted. In 1688, they invited William of Orange and his wife Mary, James's Protestant daughter, to take the throne. James fled to France.
That's the Glorious Revolution?
Exactly. It was mostly bloodless, which is why it's called glorious. But it wasn't exactly legal either. William and Mary came from the junior branch of the royal family, not the direct line. This would later lead to tensions with Scotland, eventually prompting the Act of Union in 1707, which created Great Britain.
In 1689, William and Mary accepted the English Bill of Rights, which limited royal power and gave Parliament control over laws and taxes. They also passed the Test Act, which barred Catholics from holding public office or serving in the army.
That doesn't sound very tolerant.
It wasn't, but many Protestants saw it as protecting the state.
From then on, England was a constitutional monarchy. The monarch remained head of state, but real power rested with Parliament, and eventually the Prime Minister, who became head of government.
England became a constitutional monarchy, but the Dutch Republic went even further, right?
Yes. The Netherlands declared independence from Spain in the late 1500s, and by the 17th century had become a republic. That meant no king at all.
Political power was held by regents, or wealthy merchant oligarchs, in each province. The States General was their federal assembly, and while it existed, each province acted independently.
So the Dutch had a government without a king?
That's right. In times of crisis, they appointed a stadtholder, who was kind of like a military leader. But it wasn't a monarchy. It was more of a republican system, where power rested with the merchant elite.
And this republicanism was paired with a high level of religious tolerance, especially in cities like Amsterdam. Jews, Catholics, and dissenting Protestants could worship more freely than almost anywhere else in Europe.
Was that part of what made the Dutch so wealthy?
It helped. The Dutch invested in global trade, shipbuilding, and banking. The Dutch East India Company dominated trade in Asia, and the Bank of Amsterdam became a financial hub.
They also pioneered modern capitalism. Stocks, insurance, and futures contracts developed in this environment.
So their government, economy, and society were all very different from the absolutist model.
Yes, and that's part of what makes this period so fascinating. Different paths to state power were possible.
One thing I noticed in the chapter was the importance of art and culture. How did that connect to all this political stuff?
Great question. Rulers didn't just use armies and laws to build power. They also used culture, especially Baroque art, to impress, inspire, and intimidate.
Baroque art was big, emotional, and dramatic. It reflected the grandeur of monarchs and the glory of the Catholic Church. Think of ceiling paintings with angels bursting through the clouds, or royal portraits with shining armor and flowing robes.
In France, Louis XIV commissioned architecture and paintings that glorified his image as the Sun King. Versailles itself was a work of propaganda as much as a palace.
So people would walk through Versailles and think, this king is really powerful.
Exactly, that was the point.
In music, you had composers like Johann Sebastian Bach, who worked in German courts and churches. His music combined complex structure with emotional power, very Baroque.
Was this just a Catholic thing?
No. Baroque culture appeared across Europe. Catholic states, like Austria and Spain, used it to support the church, but Protestant rulers also used it to celebrate power and order.
And in the Dutch Republic, art reflected different values, paintings of merchants, family life, and still lifes. Artists like Rembrandt and Vermeer focused on everyday scenes rather than kings and saints.
So art reflected the politics of each place.
Precisely. Absolutist states used art to elevate rulers. More commercial republican states used art to celebrate civic values.
We've talked a lot about monarchs, parliaments, and armies. But how did these changes affect regular people? The peasants, artisans, and townsfolk?
That's an important question. In both absolutist and constitutional states, ordinary people were affected by increased taxation, military conscription, and religious control. Centralization didn't just change court politics, it shaped daily life.
For example, in France, Louis XIV's wars required enormous funding. Taxes fell hardest on the peasants, since nobles and clergy were often exempt. Food shortages and taxation fueled resentment, though rebellion was usually crushed.
So the nobility were protected and the peasants paid for the wars?
Essentially, yes. And in Eastern Europe, things were even more severe. In Austria, Prussia, and Russia, rulers strengthened serfdom to maintain noble support.
Serfdom was a system where peasants were tied to the land. In places like Hungary or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, nobles gained almost total control over the rural population. In Russia, serfs could even be bought and sold by the 18th century.
That sounds a lot like slavery.
The line between the two could be very thin, especially in Russia. Serfs were not technically property, but they had very few rights and no freedom of movement.
One way rulers kept nobles loyal was by letting them dominate the peasants. In return, nobles helped enforce royal policies and staffed the expanding military and bureaucracy.
That's the deal you mentioned earlier with the Junkers in Prussia, right?
Exactly. And Peter the Great made similar deals with the boyars in Russia. They had to serve the state, but in return, they kept their grip on the serfs.
What about towns and cities? Did they have any power?
In places like the Dutch Republic or England, urban elites gained more influence. Merchants and guild leaders in Amsterdam or London often served on city councils and had ties to national governments.
But in absolutist states like France, town autonomy declined. Royal intendants replaced local leaders, and state officials controlled urban police, courts, and tax collection.
How did religion fit into all this?
Religion remained a key source of conflict and control. In Catholic countries like France and Austria, the state and the church worked together to promote unity. Louis XIV even revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, making Protestantism illegal.
That forced around 200,000 Huguenots, French Protestants, to flee the country, many to the Dutch Republic, Prussia, or North America.
That must have hurt France's economy.
It did. Many Huguenots were skilled artisans and merchants.
In England, the Anglican Church remained the official faith, but tension continued with Puritans, Catholics, and dissenters. Laws like the Test Act excluded non-Anglicans from holding office.
So even constitutional governments could be intolerant?
Absolutely. Freedom of religion was very limited across most of Europe.
But the Dutch were a notable exception. While the Reformed Church was official, the Dutch Republic allowed religious minorities to worship privately. This made cities like Amsterdam havens for Jews, Huguenots, and Catholic exiles.
That probably helped their trade and cultural life, too.
Exactly. Tolerance attracted talent and capital.
Earlier, you mentioned differences in how absolutist and constitutional governments treated people. Can we compare them more directly?
Sure. In absolutist France, political power was centralized, and the king ruled by decree. Representative bodies like the Estates General weren't called for over a century.
In constitutional England, Parliament had to approve new taxes and laws. The Bill of Rights in 1689 legally limited the monarch's power and protected certain rights, like freedom of speech in Parliament.
So in England, people had more protections?
In theory, yes. But most rights applied to property-owning men. Women, the poor, and religious minorities were still marginalized.
And the Dutch Republic?
It was more commercial and decentralized. Power was shared among provinces and cities. Local governments had real authority, and there was no king at all.
But it wasn't democratic. A few wealthy families, the regents, controlled most political decisions.
So all these systems were different, but none of them were perfect.
Exactly. Some centralized power through monarchy, others through merchants or parliaments, but all struggled with inequality, conflict, and control.
One last thing, what about women in this period? Did their lives change?
That's a complex topic. For elite women in court societies like Versailles, there was some political influence through salons or royal relationships. But legal and economic rights were extremely limited.
In Protestant areas like the Dutch Republic or parts of Germany, middle-class women sometimes ran businesses, especially as widows. But most women were confined to household roles.
So the rise of powerful states didn't do much for gender equality?
No, and in some cases things got worse. Stronger states often reinforced patriarchal laws to maintain order.
This has been a lot to process. So to sum it up, in the 1600s, states centralized power in different ways. Some monarchs ruled absolutely, others had to work with parliaments or provinces. Culture, religion, and everyday life all reflected these changes.
Exactly. And these developments laid the groundwork for modern ideas about government, citizenship, and rights. Topics we'll explore in our next episode on the Enlightenment.
The questions asked in the 1600s, who should rule, by what right, with what limits, didn't disappear. They evolved, and Enlightenment thinkers picked up the thread.
Thanks again, professors. This has been an epic journey through absolutism, constitutionalism, and the rise of the modern state. I'm Casey Brooks, and this is the Once and Future Present. Stay curious and think critically.